There was no shouting in the room, no brass knuckles, no rubber hoses, just the soft clink of porcelain tapping against wood. The SS General had been sweating it out, awake for damn near 40 hours. Not because some American GI had worked him over. Not because they'd strapped him under the hot lights and screamed at him to spill his guts. But because he had been waiting for the rough stuff his doctrine had trained him to take. Violence. Instead, the room smelled different. It didn't reek of damp stone. It didn't smell like sour sweat soaked into field gray wool. It didn't smell like fear. It smelled like Joe. Real, honest-to-God coffee. Dark, fresh, bitter. The kind of brew that hadn't been stretched in some bombed-out factory, using roasted chicory and burnt barley. The silver spoon made a soft metallic circle against the rim. It echoed. That sound broke something invisible in the room. The General swallowed hard, without meaning to. His mouth was a dust bowl. He hadn't tasted real coffee in years, and she didn't even give him a passing glance. She simply took a sip. He watched the steam rise. He didn't know it yet, but the third degree had already started. The setup wasn't some Hollywood picture. That was the whole gag. It was a requisitioned office in a busted-up building behind the American lines. Plastered dust in the corners. A window taped with an X where the glass had spidered. A single lamp throwing a hard circle of light on the desk. Outside, the war machine was humming. Engines idling. Combat boots grinding the gravel. The dull thud of heavy artillery that nobody batted an eye at anymore, because it was just the soundtrack of the job. Inside, dead quiet. And it smelled wrong. Not blood, not smoke, not cordite. Coffee. Real coffee carries weight in the nose. It doesn't just smell pleasant. It signals warmth, a safe house, a world where you can actually choose what you put in your mug. In that room, it was an insult to the situation. It had no business being there. For the SS General, that was the first crack in the armor. He'd been living in a carousel of stale air and sheer exhaustion. Days of damp bread, lukewarm water, and waiting. The kind of waiting that turns the clock into a weapon, even when nobody lays a finger on you. He had braced himself for violence. A kraut like him expects dog faces with murder in their eyes, knuckles taped, barking questions. Instead, he got the silent treatment, and a sister who treated him like a stack of misplaced paperwork. She didn't come busting through the door with MPs hauling him to his feet. She didn't posture. She didn't even look like she was on the clock. She just dropped a manila, folder on the table, flipped it open, and started reading like a quartermaster checking inventory. Then she put the cup between them. Porcelain. Not a dented tin canteen cup. Porcelain. Clean, pale, almost domestic. You could tell right off the bat it came from an outfit that still had its act together. A staff mess that still gave a damn about keeping up appearances. The German's eyes locked onto it without permission. His mouth watered before his kraut pride could put the brakes on. Saliva pooling. A dry swallow that screamed weakness, even if he fought it tooth and nail. His throat was sandpaper. He hadn't caught any shut-eye in days. Not because he was taking a beating, but because they'd run the oldest play in the book on him. Keep him off balance, slightly in the dark, never fully comfortable, never knowing what the next play was. Then came the spoon. It wasn't strictly necessary. She could have stirred it with a pencil. Or not at all. But she used a spoon that made a sound. Not loud, not dramatic. Just dead-on precise. Metal against porcelain. A clean, repeating clink, measured, controlled, almost patient. In that room, it echoed like a metronome. It laid down the tempo. It told his nerves. You're not calling the shots on the clock here, pal. She stirred it slow, the dark surface shifting in small circles. Steam rose in a steady ribbon. The smell got thicker, filling the space between them like a brick wall. He tried to keep his eyes front. No dice. His peepers tracked the steam. His pupils pinned. His hands, the same mitts that signed orders, stamped papers, and carried the iron fist of the Reich, had the shakes under the table. Not from the jitters of catching a bullet, from pure involuntary hunger. That's what made it so damn humiliating. She took a slow drag of it, cool as a cucumber, like she was sitting in a corner booth alone. Then she set the cup down again. A soft click of porcelain on wood. And she went right back to reading the file, turning a page with the dry sound of paper. Another sound that had no business being in a war zone. It was the sound of the bureaucracy, outliving the battlefield. He waited for the shakedown. It never came. That dead air wasn't empty. It was engineered, because in that silence, his brain started filling in the blanks. What they knew, what they didn't, what cards they were holding. A trained brass hat can sweat out a direct interrogation. He can pick his lies, strike a pose, control the rhythm. But he can't fight being treated like yesterday's trash. She never barked. "You're gonna sing." She never threatened him with the firing squad. She just let him sit in that smell. Minutes dragged. The coffee cooled. The aroma changed to hair, less sharp, a little more bitter. His gaze flicked to it again. She didn't flinch. Playing it cool wasn't just cheap cruelty. It was a whole lot worse for him. It laid down the pecking order. She was holding a winning hand, and she didn't even need to rub his nose in it. She had the backing of a country flush enough to ship roasted beans across the pond. He was fronting for a machine that, by 45, couldn't even keep its own officers from starving. That's what was eating him alive. Not as some grand speech, but as a gut punch. Hitler promised them they'd rule the roost. The Yanks were serving hot Joe in a bombed-out building, like winning the war was just another day at the office. And then she finally piped up. Not a question. A flat nickel-and-dime observation, delivered the way a clerk talks to a guy late on his taxes. Your unit was moved twice in 3 weeks. She said it like she already had the receipts. He blinked. His mouth opened a crack, then snapped shut. He saw the snare. Correct her. And he shows he cares. Clam up, and he buys the premise. She turned another page. The spoon tapped the rim again, just once. And his breathing shifted. Faster, shallower, like a guy humping up a hill with no wind left. He was waking up to a nightmare worse than a rubber hose. This wasn't interrogation by force. This was interrogation by atmosphere. A slow-motion chokehold, suffocating him with comfort he couldn't touch. If you wanted to put the screws to a Jerry officer in late 44 or early 45, you didn't have to lay a finger on him. You just had to quietly remind him what the war had done to his fatherland, using something small, something ordinary he used to take for granted. Coffee was the ace in the hole, because it wasn't just a drink. It was proof that the world was still spinning right side up somewhere else. By the last year of the big show, Germany didn't have coffee anymore. Not on the level, not at scale, not the kind that smelled like roasted beans. The Allied blockade, the sunk convoys, and the strain of total war had turned coffee into a ghost story, something you remembered from before the lights went out. What the Krauts got instead had a polite name, Ersatzkaffee, substitute coffee. But substitute is a nice way of saying roasted chicory, acorns, sugar beets, and whatever dirt they could brown up and boil. It wasn't just a bum deal. It was a signed confession that their machine was busted. A country bragging about lasting 1,000 years couldn't even scrounge up a basic pick-me-up for its own people. So they fed 'em a phony. The brass knew it too. The brass knew it too. Especially the brass. Not because they had it the hardest, but because they knew how to read the writing on the wall. A staff officer reads logistics the way a doc reads a pulse. When the cheap knockoffs replace the real McCoy, you aren't just losing comfort, you're losing the war. So when that SS general smelled real Joe in an American-held room, it didn't register as a lucky break. It registered as a threat. It said, "We can still foot the bill for the good stuff. Not back in New York, not in Washington. Right here, on the front line." That detail is the clincher. It wasn't just that the Yanks had coffee. It was that they had it where it had no business being. In a combat zone, in a ruined building, sitting on a dusty desk. That's logistics flexing its muscles. A German staff officer was brainwashed to believe in their own organization. The Reich was supposed to be a well-oiled, disciplined juggernaut. The Americans were supposed to be soft, commercial, decadent. A bunch of pampered pushovers. But looking him dead in the eye was the exact opposite. An enemy living comfortably because of their endurance. A cup of coffee that needed Liberty ships, warehouses, railheads, trucking lines, and stock control. An entire industrial backbone just to land on that table. And it got there anyway. That's why coffee turns into psychological dynamite. It carries the invisible weight of the whole U.S. Army behind it. He couldn't help doing the math. The American dog face in the trenches had rations. Standardized boxes, C rations, K rations, chocolate squares that didn't melt and actually tasted like sugar. Reliable. And reliability is what breaks a guy who thought his side held all the aces. Because by the tail end of the war, the Krauts were living in a madhouse. Trains didn't show. Gas was promised and never delivered. Units got marching orders and had to ditch their trucks because the tanks were dry. Mail stopped. Rumors became the daily news. Even the hardest diehards felt the ground crumbling under their boots. And right across the table was an enemy who could still afford unnecessary luxuries. That's the real kick in the teeth. Not the luxury itself, but the spare capacity. The dame knew it without spelling it out. She didn't give him a soapbox speech about the American factories. She didn't mention the blockade. She just let him smell the evidence. Because a smell dodges the razzle-dazzle. You can fight the propaganda. You can put up a wall against words. But a smell yanks you straight backward. One clean breath and he's no longer an SS hotshot in a ruined town. He's a guy remembering civilian life, cafes, a world where he was the one holding the menu. Then his brain snaps back to the present and the contrast is a killer. That contrast also blew a hole right through the Nazi myth. The Reich sold the idea of hardness, that Germans could walk through hell while the rest of the world cried uncle. But the Americans were showing off a different hand, one that made the Nazi brain short-circuit. They could be lethal and well-supplied. They could dish out hell and still enjoy a hot cup of joe, not because they were weak, but because their machine was so massive that comfort was just a byproduct of winning. That's what made the coffee dangerous, not the caffeine, the implication. And for an SS general, a guy who spent years playing God, it hit close to home. If the Yanks had coffee to burn here, what else were they flush with? Time, guards, paper, patience. It meant they weren't sweating him for answers because they were desperate. They were sweating him because they had all day to do it by the book. And doing it by the book terrifies a prisoner. You can wait out chaos. But method is a meat grinder. The woman's icy calm made it cut deeper. If a GI had pulled this stunt, he might have read it as a chest-thumping contest. He could posture back, but getting the cold shoulder from a dame. That introduced a brand new flavor of humiliation. The SS boys were built on strict hierarchy. The Nazi playbook said women stayed on the sidelines. Yet here she was, running the show, holding the prize, calling the tempo, never raising her voice, never needing to. and the harder he tried to play it tough, the more his body ratted him out. The swallow, the stare, the tight jaw, the slight lean forward when the steam drifted his way. Those were tells, and she knew how to read a tell. So by the time she finally asked anything that mattered, she'd already laid down the law of the room. He wasn't cracking from the fear of a rubber hose. He was cracking from the stone-cold truth that his world was washed up, and hers was sitting pretty. The coffee wasn't a beverage. It was an exhibition, a quiet way of saying, "Your Reich can't even toss you a bone anymore. And we bring the good life with us wherever we go." That's why, when he finally opened his yap, it didn't feel like caving to an interrogation. It felt like surrendering to the raw facts. He had braced himself for a certain breed of American. That was his first screw-up. In his head, the third degree had a shape, a sound, a rhythm, a room full of heavy hitters, boots scraping concrete, cheap cigarette smoke, a voice cracking like a bullwhip, a show of force meant to make a guy sweat about what comes next. German brass, especially the SS, were trained to eat that kind of pressure for breakfast. Not because they were fearless, but because their whole racket was built on acting tough. They were taught to swallow the pain and never give the enemy the satisfaction of a flinch. They expected the roughhouse because the roughhouse was their native tongue. And when you expect a beating, you can armor up for it. You clench your jaw, lock your eyes, and play the loyal martyr. But he didn't get the roughhouse. He got a sister who didn't need him to be scared of her. That kind of leverage is a whole different animal, and it's a hell of a lot harder to fight. Because what she was pulling wasn't a shakedown. It was colder, and for him, a lot more toxic. She was treating him like an administrative headache, a file, a date, a name to cross off a list, not a rival, not a monster, not even a worthy adversary. Just something in the inbox. That's where the psychology does a flip. A guy like him can take threats, because a threat means you still matter. It means you've got something they want bad enough to yell about. But her playing it cool meant time was on her side, that she could sit there till the cows came home, and he'd still be rotting in that chair when she got back, because his world was a locked door, and hers was a hallway full of exits. That's why her routine gutted the SS ego faster than a blackjack ever could. He came from a mob obsessed with rank and ritual. They wanted visible submission. They made their boys believe the uniform was everything. And now, in this room, his rank wasn't worth a plugged nickel. Not the uniform, not the shiny pins. By this stage of the war, high-value targets were stripped of their belts and badges anyway. A plain tunic. No authority left. And what replaced the grand Nazi symbol was something pathetic. A chair, a prisoner number, an MP outside the door who couldn't care less. So when she sat down, she didn't just bring the Joe. She brought the hardest pill to swallow. In this room, the Reich was already dead and buried. And then she kicked the second leg out from under him. The gender game. For a guy brainwashed by Hitler, a woman calling the shots wasn't just a surprise. It was deeply, fundamentally wrong. His brain scrambled to make sense of it just to protect his pride. He tried to write her off. She's just a secretary, a translator, a pencil pusher keeping the seat warm for the real boss. That's how he keeps his sanity intact. But she didn't play the secretary. She didn't bat her eyelashes or ask for permission to speak. She ran the clock. That detail, the pacing, is the shiv in the ribs. She takes her sweet time unfolding a paper. She marks it with a pencil. She checks her watch but doesn't look at him. She jots down a note, not for his benefit, but for the permanent record. Every move broadcasts the same signal. You ain't the star of this picture, Fritz. For a narcissist in an SS uniform, that's a fatal wound. He probably tries the oldest trick in the book. The sneer. A cheap laugh. A snide remark to drag her into the mud. Because if he can make her mad, he can turn it back into a man-to-man brawl. But she doesn't bite. That's the knockout punch. She treats his tough guy act like radio static, and contempt ignored quickly turns into full-blown panic. He's out of ammo. His lip doesn't change her rhythm. Even playing dumb doesn't work. A trained prisoner uses silence as a weapon. You make 'em wait. You starve 'em for answers. But her silence didn't feel like a standoff. It felt like she was just waiting for the next bus to arrive. So his silence became useless. And when silence stops working, all you have left is your own skin and bones. And the body is a lousy liar. The eyes keep drifting back to the coffee. The throat locks up. The heavy breathing fills the room. The hunger, the lack of shut-eye. It didn't even need to be called torture.